is Community Unity Now. And first of all, thank you so much to Reverend Catherine Brown D. Tycoon, founder of Community Unity Now, that we have this platform. And this is Bill Morton, president of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce, and I am Trudy Leong, administrator of the Rogers Park Chamber of Commerce, and the two of us are your co-hosts for tonight. Our very special guest tonight is Jamie Kalven, the founder of the Invisible Institute, a watchdog media organization. How are you today, Jamie?
I'm good. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you. So, how is Invisible Institute different from other watchdog organizations?
Well, I think we have a lot in common with other investigative journalism organizations. And if I were going to sort of distinguish what we do, first, we're very focused on a particular set of issues with respect to racial injustice in the criminal justice system. And some watchdog organizations sort of cover a wide range of issues. We're very, very concentrated on criminal justice issues, and particularly racial disparities in policing. But I think the other thing that sort of distinguishes our work is we really try to take the perspective of the communities most affected by unconstitutional and abusive law enforcement practices. So, as opposed to some reporting is at a kind of policy level and then looks for case studies to illustrate a set of ideas about policy, we always start with and return to and orient from the lived experience of those in Chicago neighborhoods most affected.
Do you get your material from your leads? Do they come from the community, or do you hear about them and then you go out to investigate?
That's interesting. There's sort of multiple ways in which leads come to us. And, the Invisible Institute grew out of my reporting as an individual. And I spent more than a decade in the 90s into the 2000s immersed in high-rise public housing on the South Side. And, in a setting that nobody was really reporting from or had relationships in. So I have, all sorts of sources that grow out of that period in my work. But some of the most significant, so stories come to us from the community for sure. And we have a very active tip line, people getting in touch with stories and cases they want us to investigate. But I think it's also significant to say that some of the most important leads and tips have come from whistleblowers within law enforcement. And the great example is the Laquan McDonald case. And we wouldn't know about the Laquan McDonald case, and I wouldn't have investigated it, was it not for somebody in law enforcement who reached out and within a week of the incident and said, this is not what was reported. It was horrific. And let me know that there was a video, that there was dash cam video of the incident. So, I think that's something that people sometimes don't appreciate about the kind of reporting that my colleagues and I do, is that even though we're intensely critical of the police department often, some of our most important sources of stories and sources of information are within law enforcement.
Could you tell us a little bit about your investigative process?
It varies depending on the nature of the story. So I guess there's one other thing in response to Trudy's initial question that's distinctive about the Invisible Institute and relates to our style of investigation. In 2014, after almost 10 years of litigation, we won a lawsuit in which I was the plaintiff, Kalven versus Chicago, that essentially broke down the wall of official secrecy around investigative files of police misconduct. So when various oversight agencies have investigated police misconduct, that had always been treated as not being public. It had been withheld from the public. And we won a case that established the principle that that information belongs to the public. And we then invested a lot of energy in creating something, which I urge your audience to take a look at, called the Citizens Police Data Project, where we, CPDP, where we sort of house all of this information. So you can look up your neighborhood, your police beat, particular officers, and get information about those officers' disciplinary histories. So one of the unusual things about our work is that it sort of brings together on the ground investigation, knocking on doors, talking to lots of people on the street with access to the data. So, it's possible, say, I've done a major investigation of a group of officers in the last years of public housing who were shaking down drug dealers. So, a lot of my sources for that are their victims within the community, but we also have a mass of data about all the complaints against them, the lawsuits against them. So that's really been a kind of a game changer for investigative reporting, to have all of that data and information, because otherwise, you only really find out about these things almost by chance. Somebody reaches out to you with a tip, but now it's possible to actually go into the data and see patterns. A group of an officer who has an unusually high number of complaints, or a group of officers who are detailed together, who all have a high number of complaints, and it can't just be a statistical accident. Something must be going on there. And that's not proof of wrongdoing, but it's a really powerful lead. But mostly, this kind of work can take years. It's mostly really a kind of a sustained effort. And that's why it's increasingly rare, because with the economic crisis in journalism, it's hard for newspapers and publications to support the kind of long-term investigative work required to break some of these stories. A good example of sort of investigative practice would be the Laquan McDonald case. So in that instance, I got a tip from somebody who I have not named to this day. I've protected the identity of the source, who somebody in law enforcement close to the investigation, who said the shooting a week ago is not at all what was reported. It was an execution. There's dash cam video, and he gave me a little bit of information, enough information that I was ultimately able to track down a civilian witness to the shooting. Somebody who had been driving, it occurred at 41st and Pulaski, and somebody who had been driving down Pulaski, and as the incident unfolded from his car, had an unimpeded view. So, the first thing I did was I went out and knocked on a lot of doors trying to find out what I could find out about Laquan McDonald himself, which was actually very little. Then, in retrospect, I think I kind of stalked the civilian witness. He had just a few weeks before witnessed an atrocity by the police. He was very concerned about a retaliation from the police. I left notes for him under his door. I talked to his wife, and finally he came to the door after multiple visits, and was very alarmed to see me. I've since named who he is. His name is Jose Torres, and he's an admirable, really upstanding individual who is deeply hospitable. But when he first saw me, he was alarmed. If I could find him, could police officers who might want to retaliate against him find him? So I stood on the top step. It was actually raining, and I stood on the top step, the entrance to his house. He stood under I was in the rain. He wasn't. It was kind of be a good scene in a movie. And and one of the things about this kind of reporting is you just kind of calmly keep trying to engage somebody. And he and I kept talking for about 20 minutes. And eventually, and this was a reflection of how decent he was, he couldn't kind of help but tell me what he had seen. It had disturbed him so much. And I, at that point, and he just, what he described was what we've all now seen in the famous video, which was, that an officer unloaded a barrage of shots, most of them while the boy was on the ground, writhing in pain. So one or two shots took him to the ground, and then, 16 shots. So, as many as 14 or 15 additional shots. So he described that. And at that point, I knew that there was a story here. These incidents are really, really hard to report. You just often something bad happened, but you can't get enough really solid information to go to press with it. And I've had a number of instances where I haven't been able to publish, even though I've been personally convinced that something terrible had happened. In this instance, I was all in on the story once I talked to Mr. Torres. And the next move I made, and interestingly, as far as I know, no other journalist did this, is I sought the autopsy. And it takes a while for autopsy reports to be made public. I went to Tony Preckwinkle, the president of the Cook County Board, who is a source and who I know. And I asked her if she could find out the information about, the sort of top level information from the autopsy. And, a few days later, we saw each other. She didn't even say hello. She just immediately, and was clearly shaken, said 16 shots, front and back, meaning front and, in the front and back of his body. And then a week or so later, I was able to use the Freedom of Information Act to actually get the autopsy report. But as soon as I had Mr. Torres, and as soon as I knew from President Preckwinkle that the boy was shot 16 times, then I started, writing and preparing to report the story. And this is a really important thing about investigative reporting. It's rare that you can actually definitively say what happened. And I still can't. I mean, I've seen obviously 100 times the video. It's still hard to completely nail down what happened that night. But what I was able to report within, a couple of months of the incident was that the city's account of what happened, the city's story of what happened, aggressive young man with a knife lunges at officer shoots him in self-defense and in defense of his fellow officers. He dies sometime later. That was the official story by the city. And so what my reporting did is it didn't definitively say what happened that night, but it did say that the city's story could not possibly be true. You couldn't have an autopsy that showed 16 shots and the testimony of a credible witness like Jose Torres. It just could not be true. And Torres was very clear that the boy was actually trying to get away from the police rather than lunging towards them. So that gives some sense of the methodology. And then the other thing that my reporting did, it appeared in a publication called Slate, which has millions of viewers, and it made known that there was a video. And at that point, every journalism organization in the country sought the video, and it ultimately came out, but it only came out, 13 months later. And that was, I think that had the video come out around the time that I reported or soon after, the Emanuel administration would have had a bad week, but it wouldn't have cratered. To have withheld it for 13 months meant that when it finally came out in response to public pressure and an order from a judge, people were not only appalled by what they saw, a murder by the police. We now can call it a murder, Officer Van Dyke having been convicted. They also knew that the city had this information within hours of the incident and withheld it for more than a year. And I think it was that caused the political implosion that kind of continues to reverberate.
How long did it take you to get the finalized autopsy report?
I think it was only a week or two after I talked to Tony Preckwinkle. So it was a matter of, and I'm sure that she facilitated my getting it very quickly. So as soon as it was available by FOIA, they contacted me, and they had at the coroner's office, they had it for me immediately. And I have to say that for me, I've done a lot of this kind of reporting over the years, and am a fairly seasoned and a fairly cool customer. That was a really hard story to write because an autopsy, I don't know if you guys have ever read an autopsy in a murder case or something like this. It is almost like it's as close to the victim testifying as to what happened that we'll ever get. I mean, an autopsy is a narrative. The coroner writes out a narrative, and it's a narrative about each bullet, how it entered, where it entered, what damage it did. And so, I knew what the essence of the story was, but my challenge was to write an article that kind of conveyed that without just reproducing the autopsy, kind of conveyed that narrative and that testimony of the corpse, so to speak. And I do remember coming to the end of working on that article and just being really shaken by the whole process.
Did you receive any recognition for the report? Because you
Oh,
were the one that
God.
broke the story.
I have received so much more recognition than I deserve. I mean, I won the Polk Award, which is along with the Pulitzer, is the major award in journalism. I won something called the Ridenhour Courage Prize. I probably won a dozen awards for it. And on every occasion, I expressed my gratitude, which I feel, and said that, I would not have done this reporting were it not for two individuals, the person in law enforcement who tipped me off and Mr. Torres. So I sometimes, they were the ones who took real risks, each of them, and acted really honorably. And it was their integrity and their courage that enabled me to write a story. And I'm glad that the story was well received. But I sometimes do feel like we journalists get more credit than we deserve, and our sources get less than they deserve. Anyway, I've been thoroughly decorated, and I don't need another award the rest of my career.
Are there, this is definitely was your most impactful story. What would you say is your second most impactful story?
So my second, and I would argue in some ways that the second one might ultimately be more impactful, is I did a series of articles called The Code of Silence. And if you just Google my name and Code of Silence, it'll come up. And it was on an international publication, The Intercept. And, Code of Silence appeared in The Intercept in 2016. And it tells the story, and again, with police sources. So I had two whistleblower officers who were major sources for this. It tells the story of a group of gang tactical officers operating in public housing in its final chapter, as the buildings were being demolished, who were part of the drug trade, who essentially ran a protection racket. Drug dealers would pay them off and they would protect them. And drug dealers who didn't pay them off, they would target, and they would take the drugs from those drug dealers and feed them to their own drug lines and their own allies. And when people didn't cooperate with their criminal ends, they would actually frame them on drug charges. So they would say, where are the drugs and money? If you don't tell me where the drugs and money are, I'll put this package of drugs on you and arrest you. Since that article appeared, and the principal officer, if you look it up, there's been lots of publicity over time. The principal officer is a guy named Ronald Watts. So it's referred to as the Watts scandal. And since I wrote those articles, there have been 109 exonerations, 109 convictions vacated. There's another 100 pending of people who have plausible claims of having been framed by these officers. That actually means much, much more to me than the awards, the idea that people have been exonerated. And I'm working now on a case that, also it has to do with Watts and that whole history of 4 men who are in prison, have served 18 years of natural life sentences, meaning, there's no parole. They won't get out until they die, unless something happens. And they were also framed by Watts. And this wasn't just a drug charge. They were framed with a murder charge. So that's the story I'll be working on in coming months. But nothing, I think, for journalists, certainly journalists who do this kind of work, nothing is more gratifying than contributing to the exoneration and freedom of somebody who has been wrongfully convicted.
Because you're not only helping the person that was wrongfully convicted, you're helping their families too. It's a wide net that you're helping.
Absolutely. The impact on the families is devastating. The impact on the families is devastating. And to go back to the situation with Sergeant Watts and the development, the public housing development that they were most present in and preyed upon was called Ida B. Wells Homes, the Ida B. Wells Homes on the South Side. One of the things that happened under HUD and CHA, Chicago Housing Authority rules, and this is really terrible, and people don't know about this, is that when an individual was arrested for a drug-related crime in public housing, their whole family, their whole household was subject to eviction. And note that I said arrested. They didn't have to be convicted. Just, an arrest would set in motion a process of eviction. And so, so imagine that, there are a couple of hundred individuals.
Jamie?
Yeah.
We're so sorry. There's so much for us to learn
we've
yet,
got 5 minutes
but we're
left.
out of time.
Understood.
We have 5
Yeah.
minutes left, Trudy.
5 minutes left?
Mhm.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Well, let's continue.
Well, just to finish that point,
Yes.
the collateral damage. So let's, Watts and his team of officers coerce somebody, tell us where the drugs are. The person said, I have no idea. And they put drugs on them and arrest them. So that person may go away for many years. There are instances of people serving more than 10 years having been framed. But at the same time, under these housing rules in public housing, their family will be evicted, their grandmother, their children, the whole household will be evicted. And, so it just keeps multiplying. And remember the name Ronald Watts, because this scandal will not go away. It just keeps expanding. There's an expectation among those who have been working on these cases, the lawyers and others, that this will end up being bigger than the Burge torture scandal, the long-running saga of police torture. And I'm continuing to report that story. And I think it may emerge as one of the major stories in the city. And it may really force us, because it had such devastating impact on a whole community, it may force us as a city to begin to actually really think about reparations, to think about reparations not as a kind of abstract utopian vision, but as a practical solution.
And when I hear these stories that you're talking about, that you're reporting about, it really makes me wonder how often this occurs and that we're not hearing about.
That's a great, I really am grateful for that remark, because I think what people tend to think, even people who are really well informed, is that when an instance of abuse or corruption rises to public attention, when you pick up your newspaper or go online and it's the lead story, or when there's litigation, or when there's a big investigative report by somebody like me, I think people, almost in spite of themselves, assume that that must be the worst thing that happens. And that's why you know about it. It kind of rises to the surface because it's so terrible. Nothing in my experience supports that. We wouldn't know the name Laquan McDonald if it wasn't for somebody reaching out. Think about all the instances where something equally bad happened and nobody reached out. So I think, we're always seeing the tip of the iceberg. And the most terrible things are the things we don't know about. The most terrible things are the things that corrupt and abusive and cruel people get away with. So it's an important corrective, and I do appreciate the question.
And in this age with the cameras and the phones everywhere, maybe.
Yeah, we're beginning, and with the data, what I was describing before, as we have more information, we can look for patterns in the data and be more systematic about trying to root out abuse, if there's the political will to do it. I mean, and so often the information is there, but the political will isn't.
So the Citizens Police Data Project arose out of your lawsuit then.
They grew out of the lawsuit, and I really urge people to look at it. It's meant to be a tool for the public. So you could put in the Rogers Park neighborhood if there are particular officers that people are concerned about or have had an encounter with. All that information is there, and we invested a lot of effort and care in making it as user-friendly and kind of legible for people as we could.
Could you give us the web address for that, please?
It's I'm not even sure off the top of my head, but if you just Google the name or CPDP, it'll come up. I think it's cpdp.co, but do a Google search before you circulate the information about it.
Are you able to tell us the attorney that worked on your case, because he did a magnificent job with you to actually win this?
Oh, that's actually, so the attorney, my longtime kind of partner is a professor at the University of Chicago Law School, Craig Futterman. But when the Kalven case was argued, I was represented by Mr. Futterman, but also by the law firm Lovey and Lovey that handles a lot of these cases, and by the People's Law Office, the folks who've handled all the police torture cases. So I really had an all-star team of attorneys representing me pro bono. And the reason, they were personally generous towards me, which I appreciate, but it's also because having this information out is so useful to their clients. So they were also acting in their own interests.
Well, Jamie Kalven of the Invisible Institute, thank you so much for joining us on Community Unity Now. And likely we might want to have you as a guest another time. There is so much information to share.
It's been my pleasure, and feel free to reach out again.
Thank you.
Enjoyed talking with you both.
Thank you so much, and for everything you do.
Yes.
Take care. Thanks.
Thank you. Bill Morton, and this is Trudy Leong. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Have a great night.